Hello there, my name is Ed Romero and this is the Out of Office Chat where I talk about life outside the office. And today, I want to chat about The Midnight Library by Matt Haig. Now this book, I discovered it last fall. I had a few days to myself and I was at Barnes & Noble. I didn't pick it up then, so I held off on it, and then come Black Friday last fall or last winter, I saw it was on special and I picked it up. Saving it for a good moment. You know, the last episode I put out there was around Red Notice. It was based on a true story, so I needed something to kind of balance out the wild nature of that book. So I chose this book, and at first, again, my methodology is pick it up. If I gravitate towards it, phenomenal. I'll read through it. If not, then I'll just go on to something else. But this one, right off the bat, it was an incredible read. I wasn't able to stop turning the pages, and I just found myself going to sleep later and later. So I really did enjoy it. I had a good time. And now I'll walk you through it, the premise of it. So The Midnight Library centers around a woman called Nora Seed. Now, Nora feels as if her life really isn't going anywhere. She had lost both her parents. Her dad died when she was young. Her mom died not so long ago due to cancer. Her older gay brother, Joe Seed, doesn't talk to her. She dropped out of her band, The Labyrinths, where Joe was also a member. Additionally, she was fired by her employer at a record store. She was fired as a piano teacher. She broke up with her fiance a few months or a year earlier. She lost her cat. Her cat was hit by a car just that afternoon. So much was happening that she decided, you know what? I don't have a reason to live. So she went ahead and took her antidepressants and downed them alongside with a bottle of wine. So as death crept up on her, she found herself actually in a state between life and death. She found herself in what's called the Midnight Library, a library that had an infinite amount of books, all of whom were actually taken care of by her old librarian, Mrs. Elm. Now, Mrs. Elm shares that the Midnight Library, each book is a different version of her life. And if Nora decides to pick up a book, she can live in that life, separate from her root life. One of the first experiences she has in the Midnight Library is a massive book called the Book of Regrets. And Nora picks it up and she's just overwhelmed with every single regret that she's gone through or has had. But from there on out, she begins to get a pretty good taste of what the Midnight Library has to offer. Now, Mrs. Also shares that if she wants to go to a specific life, she definitely can. She can request it and the book will appear in front of her. She can stay in that life until she chooses that she no longer wants to be there or she is filled with regret in that life. Now, some rules include she can never go back the same life twice, that when she's out of it, she's out of it. And there's an infinite amount of books and an infinite amount of lives that she can live in the Midnight Library. So at first it's a little bumpy. She's trying to get a hang of it, trying to get a hang of how it is like in the Midnight Library, living in different lives. Her first regret that she wants to turn around is leaving her fiance, Dan. Now, Dan, his dream was to go ahead and open up a pub in a small town out in the UK. And Nora decides, I want to live that life. I want to live that life that Dan sought after. And it's not so great. So they own a bar that's barely getting by. Dan is enabling his drinking by owning that bar and having drinks every single night. On top of that, Dan cheated on Nora, not once, but twice, and doesn't seem to regret it. And lastly, Dan is kind of a jerk. He's kind of a jerk, so she realizes that. And it's pretty nice because as soon as she realizes it, her life, her perspective changes in that she had such a regret breaking up with Dan. But after this life, she's like, meh, I was better off, So she snaps out of it, goes back to the Midnight Library, decides she wants to do something else, decides she wants to take on more exciting lives. So she becomes an Olympic swimmer. Now, a little bit background on Nora. Nora grew up swimming. Her dad was very athletic and kind of pushed swimming on her. And she decided to drop it in her root life. And she always had felt that her dad was very disappointed because she dropped it. So she decides in this life, she wants to be an Olympic swimmer. She wants to make sure that she makes her daddy proud. So she gets plunged into this life, a pun. She gets plunged into this life. And she, at this point, she's a retired swimmer. Now, she's an Olympic swimmer. She's won 2 gold medals, but she's retired now for a couple of years. Rather, she goes on speaking tours, gives inspirational speeches, and she's actually pretty well known in the circuit. Her dad trained her, and he's alive and well. Now, keep in mind that in her root life, her dad died really young, when she was really young. In this life, he's still around. He's still around kicking. Unfortunately, he cheated on Nora's mom. And Nora and her brother Joe grew up with their dad while her mom was separate from them. Unfortunately, she died early on. And at this point, you can start getting a sense of like the angst that Nora feels for her father. Now, in any case, she sees that, oh, well, at least Joe, my brother, and I are talking. But even then, if the relationship is very formal, it's very businesslike, it's almost emotionless. At certain points where Nora wants to start talking about their parents growing up, he's like, are you okay? Did you take your medication? So what's hilarious about this chapter or these series of chapters is that she is up for a speech. So she's darn right in the middle, right? She's right in the middle of trying to give a speech or preparing for a speech. And she gets up there, and at first it goes really well. She's very invigorated. You know, she is very persuasive in that life will give you challenges that you have to overcome. But then she ends it with, but life sucks. Life sucks. Everyone dies. And then she decides, you know what? I'm done with this life. So she leaves that. And then she wants to be a rock star, and then she does. She gets plunged in this life where she's a rock star, and she's currently on an international tour playing in Brazil, similar to her Olympic life. She is right smack down in the middle of a major activity. She's actually playing. She's on stage. She's getting ready to finish up her last song, and they're like, "Oh, play one of the big hits." They already have a set list, so she doesn't even know what the set list is, nor does she know some of her biggest hits. So she decides to play it off by playing a song by Simon and Garfunkel called "Bridge Over Troubled Water." And the entire crowd, the entire audience, her management, her bandmates are all actually surprised and impressed with it. So after the concert, she's whisked away. She gets a phone call from her ex-husband, who was a big-time actor called Ryan Bailey. Ryan Bailey, I actually looked him up to see if it was real. It's an actor from the British syndication of The Office. I don't know if it's any relation to the one here in the Midnight Library. Thought that was interesting. But they broke up. It didn't work out. Dan in this life was a stalker, stalked Nora. And then she has a meeting with a couple of Brazilian podcast hosts, and then she begins talking, and they begin asking her a lot of questions, a lot of personal questions, and she begins to find out that, this is actually pretty hard. Like, she gets judged pretty rough. She's always in the limelight, and she feels, not attacked, but overwhelmed. And then one of the podcast hosts revealed to Nora, asks her, in light of her playing Bridge Over Troubled Water, was it in honor of her brother? And she's like, well, why would I honor him? What's the honor? And the podcast host reveals that, Nora's brother committed suicide the year prior. At this point, Nora is so distraught, she cuts the interview short. She starts walking up, stumbling. She's in such a state of grief that she just decides to leave this life. It's even when I read it, I was like, oof, that is actually really tough, because at this point you understand that Nora's life and her relationship with her brother is estranged. So they aren't on speaking terms, but to actually go through his death, it was too much. It was overwhelming for her. So she lives that life. That wasn't her life. Now, she decides she wants a life of peace. She just wants a life where she's at ease. And then she finds herself in a life where she's a wife and a mom. At this point, she's married to a gentleman named Ash, who's a surgeon. In her root life, Ash was, he courted her. He tried to go on a date with her, and she declined, In this life, she went on a date with him, and they got married. And they ended up having a daughter called Molly. It was a calm life. Ash was very much in love with Nora. It's very sweet. It's very cute because Nora begins to ask Ash, what if we live in a multiverse? And Ash is, well, that's not impossible based on what's being, discovered in science and physics. And then Nora asks, well, what if I'm from a different reality and I just popped into this one and don't remember my past? Ash was like, well, that'd make you, pretty darn interesting, So at this point, Nora realizes that Ash loves her no matter what, unconditionally. It's a beautiful thing. And she's falling in love with this life. And then she begins to formulate a relationship with Molly, her daughter, as well. And Molly really does look up to Nora. They have a really a kind relationship. She comforts Nora, or Nora comforts Molly when she wakes up in the middle of the evening. They form a routine where Nora takes Molly to school and back, and they start forming a relationship. And it's interesting how much Molly and both Ash support Nora. And in this life, she's writing a book. I believe it's a book on philosophy, and they're so darn supportive. And there's a really sweet part of the book. I was going to say scene, but I guess you can call it a scene. There's a sweet part in the book where Molly is on a scooter and she falls and bumps her chin. And she comes running to Nora, and at this point, Nora is just overwhelmed, grabs her and concern out of her this girl, and then she is just filled with this immense amount of love and concern for this little one and how they hurt themselves. So Nora begins to realize that I'm falling in love with this child. And what's funny? I've spoken to some mothers, and the emotion here is pretty accurate. I've talked to moms who say that the love that they feel for their child is just almost unbearable. It's immense, like nothing you can probably describe. So Nora does remember at a certain point, Mrs. Elm tells her that once she finds a life that she really, truly wants to live, then she'll completely forget about the Midnight Library and all the previous lives. She'll basically assimilate to the current life and live as if nothing has happened. But Nora notices that in this life, she's not forgetting any previous lives. She is still fully aware of the Midnight Library. She doesn't really understand why that's happening. Additionally, she is still feeling regret in the sense that she didn't deserve this life, that she stepped into it and stole it. So she does something peculiar. She wants to go back to her own stomping grounds. She wants to go back to her old town, which she does. And the first thing she wants to do is she wants to find Mrs. Elm. So Mrs. Elm is a real person. It's her old librarian. And when she goes to the nursing home she was in and asks for Mrs. Elm, they actually tell her that she had died a few months prior. Now, taken aback, she decides, okay, well, I'm going to just keep walking. But before leaving the nursing home, she sees her old neighbor called Mr. Banerjee. And in her root life, Mr. Banerjee and Nora had a really good relationship. Nora would bring her medicine. He would look after her. And in this life, there was no one looking after Mr. Banerjee, and he was stuck in a nursing home, and he seemed pretty confined, pretty unhappy, didn't recognize her by any stretch. And then as she keeps walking, she notices a young man is being arrested. His name is Leo. And in her root life, Leo was her piano student. And in Leo, during the root life, he was going through a rebellious stage. And his mom didn't know what to do until she hired Nora to be his piano teacher. Now, it wasn't until Nora started teaching piano to Leo that Leo really started turning his act around. He stopped being so rebellious. He focused on all his energy on the piano, and his rebellious nature, basically was pulled back. And unfortunately, because Nora wasn't here in this life, there was nothing really keeping Leo in check, and he really went all out with the rebellious nature. He was a kind of petty crook. Nora even went up to the officer and was like, "Hey, leave that boy alone. He's okay." And the officer was like, "Leo, lady, you don't know Leo. He's been arrested multiple times." So at this point, Nora feels an immense amount of regret for leaving her life and having all these things happen. Some of which you can say, it wasn't her fault, but at the same time, like how can you think otherwise if you can be in a specific position and appreciate it for what it is. So at this point, Nora decides to leave this life. And it wasn't until she goes back to Ash and Molly and begins to say goodbye, that it gets very emotional. Remember, Nora began to love this life. She began to love Ash and Molly. And, that emotion, I mean, I can only imagine it being extraordinarily difficult. So she leaves the Midnight Library and tells Mrs. Elm that I want to go back. I want to go back to my life. I want to live. So, when she goes back to her root life, she awakens. She's totally distraught. She's just downed a bottle of pills along with a bottle of wine, and she's looking for help. She goes to Mr. Banerjee, Mr. Banerjee. She knocks on the door, and Mr. Banerjee's like, "Oh my gosh, what did you do?" And she explains, "Please call the hospital. Please call the hospital." She knocks out. Next morning, she finds herself next to Joe, her brother. Joe received a text that Nora sent the night prior, basically apologizing for everything that Nora had done to him, and basically saying her goodbyes. Upon getting it, he kind of got on the next car or train or whatever on over to Nora's place, and yeah, I mean, I think at this point, you can see where it's going, and Nora does end up living different perspective on her life, does end up meeting Mrs. Elm at her nursing home. And yeah, it was a really good book. I really enjoyed it. I felt as if it was read really smoothly. I also enjoyed the subject matter. The multiverse it's a really cool topic. I wanted to do a bigger podcast on the multiverse, but it dawned on me, I'm not a physicist. I don't know anything about physics, and there is a lot of science that goes into the multiverse. So I couldn't do that. But you know what? Something I learned as I tried to kind of mix in this idea of the multiverse with this book or this episode is that there is a belief system. There are belief systems out there that believe in the multiverse or parallel realities and parallel universes. And Hinduism is a big one. Hindus believe that the multiverse exists. I also learned that in Hinduism, where they make references to parallel realities, it's found in the Puranas. So I'm not sure if anyone here is familiar with Hindu biblical text, but the Hindu biblical texts are found into four main books called the Vedas, and their encyclopedia counterpart or subgenre is called the Puranas. And in here, you have a whole bunch of lore, you have a whole bunch of descriptions of major spiritual events. At least I learned that. I thought that was pretty cool. And who knows, I might do a podcast episode about the multiverse down the road. But yeah, overall, I really enjoyed the Midnight Library. I had a good time. Really great book just to read before you're going to bed. Super easy. And my next book, you never know. I did Red Notice, which was a nonfiction, and then I wanted to switch it up a bit with a fictional book. And the next one I might do a nonfiction as well. We'll see what the subject matter is going to be. I'm on this kind of multiverse thing, so parallel reality vibe. So I might look into something like that. I'm not entirely sure. I have a couple of books lined up. One called the Midnight Library, Chaos. So something, I guess, bringing up the chaos theory that was uncovered in like the 80s or something like that, based on mathematical findings. I have no idea. I keep thinking like, oh, it's going to be an easy read. No, it's freaking hard. And then another book called The Rainbow Body. And so this book is about a Buddhist monk who dies, and kind of like the events that transpired around his death. Nothing like nefarious. It's just kind of like the supernatural events around it. But both again they read like research papers, and I just can't get through it. It's pretty tough. With that, I hope you enjoyed this episode. I appreciate you dropping in, and if anything, I'll catch you on the next one.